of kids and families in private practice and an author and a journalist. She's the author of Middle School Matters and a frequent contributor to the Washington Post. Some of you know that, for example, today she had a column in the Washington Post, 6 strategies for helping your kids to navigate the election. And I actually asked Phyllis if she would begin maybe just taking a couple minutes talking about that, because I think it definitely is something on everybody's minds. She also writes for Psychology Today, Working Mother, U.S. News and World Report, Your Teen, and her ideas have been shared in outlets including the New York Times, Atlantic, New Yorker, Edutopia, Mindshift, NPR. She lives in Bethesda, Maryland with her husband and 3 children. Just about a 15-minute drive from where I grew up. And then I think most importantly, her mother's is first cousins with my mother. And so, you should just know about that, about the cousin lineage. And her family was the sort of Shabbat home and Boston home for my sister when my sister went to MIT and spent 4 years in Boston. So Phyllis, thanks for doing this. We are grateful. Everybody, Howie Wiswer, you're gonna get, and Lynn, you're gonna get a free copy of Phyllis's book for being one of the first 10 to sign on. And Phyllis, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And yes, that is the main reason I'm here, for Cousin Daniel. I'm so excited. And thank you for coming, despite the fact that I know you're still virtual and living on Zoom. That's impressive in and of itself. I'm just going to move this a little bit. So I'm curious the age of everybody's kids. We have a small enough group that please feel free at any time to unmute yourself and ask a question or to put it in the chat. But curious how old everybody's kids are, or if you're here for a family friend or another relative.
I have a 17 and a 12-year-old.
Oh, 12. Okay, great.
We have a 9th grader, a 7th grader, and a 3rd grader.
Okay.
I have an 18-year-old.
Great. Anyone else? So sort of a range, but it looks like 11, 10 and up, it sounds like, for the most part, which is great. That just kind of helps me figure out where to orient the strategies I'm going to share. But I will talk about the election a little bit first. And in fact, I was talking to a principal at a public school in New Jersey earlier today, and we were strategizing how we're going to handle it with our students, because everybody's a little tired, a little overwhelmed. The election is layered on top of so much else that's been going on. And it was hard enough in 2016 for people. It was kind of a shock to have, to not really know what you were going to wake up to the next morning. And I think it will be that much harder this time around. And I know teachers are trying to figure out how do you have that conversation in a way that is respectful of all ideologies, all voices, and yet also addresses the fact that there are certain codes of conduct that we expect among our students in terms of not degrading anyone's humanity, not having any ad hominem attacks. And so the basic instruction that we're giving teachers is don't lose your cool. And I think it's the same advice that I would share with parents. Kids are sponges and they are absorbing the emotional energy of the adults in their lives. Emotion contagion is very real. And so we don't want anybody having really absorbing the emotions of either teachers or their parents. So if you need to take a minute and just kind of center yourself afterwards, or if you have something to process. That being said, we also want to keep it real and be authentic. If you have a 12-year-old, they 100% know what you're thinking and feeling. An 11-year-old, a 10-year-old does as well. And I think it is completely fine to say how you're feeling, but then make sure that after you say how you're feeling, you talk about how you are coping with those feelings, what you are doing. Don't just get stuck in feeling overwhelmed or exhausted, but actually tell them what you're going to do to make yourself feel better. To me, one of the most reassuring interviews I had was with man who's the head of the Atlantic Council, and it's a nonpartisan think tank. And he was talking about how no matter what the outcome is, as long as it's a fair and uncontested election, that is really America at its best. The polarization and the divisiveness is America at its worst. And that was to me the most uplifting part of all of this. Nothing is forever. And he was really encouraging us when we're talking to kids to help them hold on to optimism, because optimism is like the baking soda. It's the active ingredient. If you're not optimistic, then you are not going to think that through the power of your actions, you can make a difference. But if you are, and that doesn't mean you can't be skeptical and pursue the truth, but if you are a pessimist, you're not going to try. And so he really wanted to reinforce, and he was having the same conversation with his staff, with his adult staff. He wanted to reinforce this idea that we can all continue to work to make things better, whether it's a transfer of power or a continuation of power. The other piece that I thought was really interesting, and I think it relates to Judaism, is an interview I had with a professor at McGill, and his name is Jacob T. Levy. And I said the middle initial because every time I didn't say his middle initial, he would correct me and ask me to use his middle initial. So if you ever refer to Jacob T. Levy, make sure that you include the T in there. But he was a really interesting guy, and he's a political philosopher, and he was a little less optimistic, I would say, than the Atlantic Council guy. His attitude was that kids tend to think, and adults think as well, that with every generation, we tend to make moral progress, that we tend to make more ethical decisions, that we get better as humans, we get better, and that's actually not true. And the biggest danger is actually turning a politician into a hero or a demon, that we want to separate the politician from the policies and make sure that we are all thinking really carefully about what it is we want, what are the values that we hold dear, whether it's peace, whether it's honoring diversity, whatever it happens to be. But he really thinks that with every generation, and every individual in every generation needs to work extremely hard to make sure that we are advancing, that we are doing the right thing, because it's really easy to slide back and end up with some of the scenarios we're seeing today with immigration and other things. So that's sort of the big picture. And then on the basic level, talking to kids about the election, I think one of the things we can do to help them understand it, and help them understand it particularly if we see that there are no immediate results, or that there's some strife after the election, is to really explain how voting works, and to explain the Electoral College, and to explain things like voter suppression, all of these different terms that they're hearing but not necessarily understanding, because kids think, oh, you vote, there should be a winner or a loser, and you move on. The biggest mistake we made 4 years ago in my school was having a mock election to teach kids how elections work. And it was a huge mistake because everybody was taking sides. Everybody was really attached to a specific politician. So now this year, to teach the concept of voting, we've used things like voting for what snack you want to have at a party, or voting for whether you have more recess. We just kept it a lot more neutral. But you can have mock elections at home, and you can also use this as an opportunity to really work on critical thinking skills. Have your kids argue both sides of an issue, and really have them think about what's important to them. Is it animal rights? Is it climate? Is it racial equality? And what is it that they can do to make a difference? And even a very young child can put environmental slogans on the sidewalk with chalk. An older teen can volunteer at the polls, or can write a letter to a legislator. And that is, this comes up a little bit in my slides as well, but the recipe for stress, and this is actually another researcher from Montreal, they're doing good work in Canada. Her name is Sonia Lupien, and her recipe for stress, her research on stress, is she uses the acronym NUTS, N-U-T-S. And it's fascinating. This is pre-pandemic. The N stands for novelty, it's new. The U stands for uncertainty. You don't know how it will turn out. You've never experienced it before. You don't know when it will end. The T is for threat to ego. You don't know if you're up to it, if you can handle the threat itself. So it might be for a kid, will they have the same friends when they return back to in-person school? It could be that they're worried that they won't handle the demands of virtual learning, which involves a lot more executive functioning skills. For an adult, it could be that they're worried they're not doing a good job trying to balance their job and homeschooling, or supporting their homeschooling child. And then the S is for a sense of control. And I think everybody feels a sense of powerlessness right now. And so if you put it all together, the antidote to that nuts recipe. And I think it relates to the pandemic. I think it relates to the election. And there are so many different layers of stress right now, is to give kids back a sense of control, to give them a sense that they have some agency and that they have some control over their fate. And so I will have you, Alexander, if you don't mind grabbing my slides, I'll switch to that now. But feel free, because this is a fairly small group, so feel free to put questions in the chat as I'm going, or to unmute yourself as well. Okay, you can go to the next one, the next slide. So I'm going to break this up into two or three categories. And the first is the social, the second will be the academic, and then the third will be the emotional piece, the self-regulation. So on the social piece, and it's my understanding that most of you probably have e-learning kids. Would that be accurate? So, and I'm speaking as the mother of 3 e-learning kids, so I'm right there with you. I get it. There are 3 groups of kids that that 3 groups of kids that are struggling in different ways in the pandemic during e-learning. The first are the extroverts, and actually at first I thought this was the group that was going to have the hardest time. They were really vocal that e-learning, virtual learning was not meeting their social needs. They were really worked up. This was last spring. And so I was trying to figure out ways to help them connect with their friends. But I very quickly realized that the extroverts were in the best shape of all, because they were the very first to figure out what they needed to do to connect with their friends. They were the fastest to find alternative ways to reach out. They were more comfortable talking using different formats, particularly with the kids toward the older age. I'm in a K through 8, but the kids toward the older range were much more equipped to handle technology and to talk that way. My own 11-year-old, it was kind of a disaster because he's an 11-year-old boy. He had never had a phone. And so all of it was a really big shift for him. What I found with the extroverts, and if that describes your child, this is what I would really be focusing on, is that they have been, I would say, more likely to make mistakes, to either spread gossip or to post something that they would regret. These are the kids who like to have the best story at lunch, to have all of the attention on them. And so they're more likely to work harder to get that feedback that they're craving and that they're missing. They're also much more sensitive. Everybody is more sensitive. I've had principals tell me that teachers are far more concerned that they looked at them funny on a Zoom. Nobody is having those positive organic interactions the day after something either feels wrong or goes wrong or looks at you funny. And as a result, people are ruminating a lot more. And I'm seeing that with the extroverts a lot. And I think it's really helpful to ask them to think about whether or not they might be more sensitive, and to share situations where you felt that yourself, just to help them maybe question a little bit whether the reality is what they think in their head, or if the reality might be a little bit more nuanced. The second group of kids are the introverts, and they struggled in a totally different way. They actually struggled because of their well-meaning parents, all of us. We saw and I'm right there with you on that. We saw our kids maybe sitting on the couch, not connecting as much, not exercising as much, particularly maybe in comparison if we had another child or if we had a friend's child who seemed to be doing all these Netflix parties and, bending over backwards to connect. And what was happening is these introverts, they do like people, they do want friends, but they don't have the same need for constant social feedback. And in fact, some of them found it a relief to be learning virtually, to not have to manage all of those interactions all day long, plus sometimes sports, plus more social media. But then their well-meaning parents would come and say, come on, don't you want to call so-and-so? Don't you want to do something why don't you try joining the video game chat? I've heard those 3 kids are doing a video game chat and you can be part of it. And so those kids would tell me that they actually ended up feeling that they were disappointing their parents, that they were not enough, that they were lacking in some way. And so we want to be careful not to push the kids too far if they're not feeling lonely. Now, that doesn't mean we don't want them interacting at all, but what I've been really where I'm landing on that is we want to make sure that kids are interacting with somebody face to face, and it can be on FaceTime. It doesn't have to be in person, but interacting with somebody developing those social skills at least every couple of days. It can be a cousin, it can be a grandparent, it can be a same age peer, but doesn't have to be a same age peer. We just want to make sure that they're trying to work on those skills a little bit. Now that they're back in school, even virtually, it's a little bit better, a little bit easier to do that. The third group actually were the kids that struggled the most. These were the kids with social skills deficits. So they were already struggling before the pandemic. They were the ones who, if they were hanging out with other kids, often it was because it was structured activities, it was a sporting event, maybe it was a teacher organized lunch group, maybe it was that it could have been anything, but or a family organized get together. And so when you strip that away, a lot of these kids suddenly didn't have any interaction with other kids at all. Plus on Zoom and in Zoom classes, they would do things that would really irritate other kids. Maybe they'd make faces or interrupt. These are the kids who would try to impress instead of connect, but they'd make a lot of social mistakes. And what's a silver lining to me of the pandemic and of the virtual learning is that if that's your kid and you did not know that before, you know that now. You can really see it clear as day. And I think we don't want to shame our kids. And so we tend not to be very prescriptive or directive when it comes to social skills. But I actually think if you can do it in a way that is not public and that is really constructive, this is a really great time to work on their social skills. So you might say, I noticed that when you were talking about Pokemon, that your friend's attention drifted away after a few minutes. And I'm wondering if that's because you interrupted their conversation about a sporting event to talk about Pokemon. Why don't you have you considered trying, and you want to always ask if they're willing to have help, have you considered trying listening for a few minutes, waiting, and after 3 minutes, asking a question related to what they're talking about. So really being very concrete and giving them some strategies, because they do want to be liked and they do want to fit in. I actually had a conversation, my kids are e-learning, but I'm back in person where I'm working, the school where I'm working. And I had one of these kids in my office, and he was coming to talk to me in part because he was so lonely, because they just went back hybrid, and he's essentially had 8 months with no social interaction, nobody seeking him out. And I'm a willing person who will talk to him, and he didn't have any adults even really other than on Zoom. So he was really interested in any interaction. And I asked him for permission to help him with some of these things because he knew he was struggling. And when I shared that particular strategy with him, which is why I mentioned it tonight, it was on my mind. He said, "You're asking me to listen for 3 minutes before I ask a question?" And I said, "Is that unrealistic?" And he said, "I'm thinking maybe 13 seconds. Can we start with 13 seconds?" And I said, we can start with 13 seconds. But he knew himself, and he knew he struggles with that. All right, you can go to the next slide, Alexandra. So technology and learning, and this is a massive subject, so I'm just trying to break it down to some of the main takeaways that I've had through virtual learning. The first is what I hope will be reassuring. It's the research on dopamine. And prior to the pandemic, and if I think you all want a copy of my book, when you read the chapter or when you read any section on learning and technology, you'll notice that I include research from NIH that says that we don't want our kids online for more than 2 hours a day. That's not happening anymore. That's just not realistic. We have to think about this in a completely different way. And so I do like to think of myself as the queen of rationalization, but I also have some science behind what I'm going to share. I spoke to a psychiatrist locally who had done this research on dopamine that shows that, and I think a lot of us are familiar with this concept that when you get a like on social media or when you get a point in a video game, you get a hit of dopamine, and you get a big hit of dopamine. If you do something like bake with a sibling or go bike riding with a friend or do a puzzle with a parent, you're still going to get a hit of dopamine, but it's going to be a lower hit of dopamine. And what his research found was that you start losing your enjoyment in those lower dopamine activities the longer you spend on the high dopamine activities, but you can interrupt that process by making sure kids take a break every hour to do a lower dopamine activity. And I think that is a less onerous way to approach technology right now, to make sure our kids are getting offline every hour, even if they have to be on for a long time. And I think it's an easier sell. I think there's less conflict. And jumping around a little bit to the one that says partner with the school, that's in a sense related. I don't think anyone should be fighting with their kids right now over homework. It's just it's not worth it. And if you are at all, and if you're not in contact with this school and you're fighting at home over homework, or your kid is not willing to get on a Zoom classroom or go to a session and you know they need extra help, reach out to this school and let them help you navigate that. Nobody wants parents fighting with their kids at home, and it's just not worth it. Home should be a safe, consistent, loving place. But what you can do with your kid to just give them some background information, and every child likes being talked to as if they're older and more mature and more intellectual than they actually are. And so I love to share research with kids, because they're like, yeah, and it doesn't feel like you're telling them what they should do in the same way. So I share the data on efficiency. So the data shows that if you are doing homework and toggling back and forth between checking a text, going on social media, you might think you're multitasking well, but the data actually shows that not only are you less efficient, but you are far more stressed. The data also shows that if you have a phone on your person, even if it's off while you're taking a test, your score will go down a full letter grade. So we don't want our kids having a phone in front of them while they're doing their work. We want to really be encouraging them to separate, to monotask, not multitask. And we want to prevent the formation of bad habits. It's just a really good habit to not have that in front of you. Although I'm going to turn in myself right now, because I was talking to my own son. My oldest is a college freshman. He's virtual as well, but he's virtual on campus. And he was telling me today that he was having trouble concentrating. I think we're all having trouble concentrating, but he has to concentrate because he has midterms this week. And I said, you know what you should do? You should put your phone away, make sure even the notifications on your computer are off, so that you can really just focus on one thing. And then an hour later, I sent him a text that said, is everything okay? You didn't respond to my text. I totally forgot that I was the one who had told him not to do it. So we get so entrenched in our habits that we get in our own way. It's good to remind ourselves to try to do one task at a time. But other ways to prevent bad habits are to just make sure there's no technology in their bedroom, that they're getting a good night's sleep. If you ever want to annoy a teacher, tell them that your child was up really late and you didn't put them to bed on time. 90% of the time, especially if it's a younger kid, if a teacher comes to me, it's to ask me if I will talk to the parents about making sure their kid goes to bed earlier. Plus, they're going to make mistakes late at night. If they don't have a phone in their room, they're less likely to get themselves in trouble. So this, if learning remotely, school is their workplace, and I included resources at the very end. I'm never going to get through all of my slides, but at the very end, there's a slide with a lot of articles and resources you can look at later. One of them is an article that Heidi Stevens wrote for the Chicago Tribune, but she talked to me for this article, so I went on and on about why we need to stop bothering our kids while they're trying to learn at home. I do it myself. We have a new puppy, and I'm constantly yelling up to one of my e-learning kids to go take the puppy out, that he's barking, and I'm trying to work, and you need to get the puppy outside. And then I have to remind myself that this is their workplace. This is their school. Their school day is their work day, and it's not the time to ask them to unload the dishwasher or to take out the trash. We really want to respect that this is the time they need to focus on learning. We also want to get their input. So going back to the idea of a phone, one of my favorite stories is from a design thinker who's a professor at UPenn. And he was talking with me about his own kid, and they were fighting over the phone. And because he's a design thinker, design thinkers iterate. They come up with lots of different solutions to a problem. And if it doesn't work, they come up with another one. And so he was working with his kid on what they could do, experimenting, trying to put the phone on a high shelf, which wasn't working. And ultimately what they realized was if the phone was not on this kid's person, like right on top of him, he was too anxious. It was too distracting to him not to have it on his person. But his father didn't want it even visible. And so what they ultimately compromised and did is that they put the phone in a sealed envelope. And he could have it in front of him in a sealed envelope, but he wasn't allowed to open the envelope until a specific time, which was really kind of genius for a number of reasons. Number one, it was a creative idea, but also it got his own kids buy-in, and he felt ownership of the process of figuring out what they were going to do. If all of you have those 10, 11, 12-year-olds, I know they lie all the time. They're like, crazy bad liars too. Like you always know when they're lying. And so don't set them up to lie. If you know they didn't do their homework, or if you know they didn't check in their phone, if you have an electronics basket, don't say, did you put your phone away? Don't say, did you do your homework? Say, I'm going to need you to put your phone away, or I'm going to need you to do your homework. We want to make sure that we are also giving kids a path back to being a good kid. So if they make a mistake, which they will, whether they're mean to somebody else, whether they don't treat a sibling well, whatever it happens to be, we want to make sure that we are helping them figure out what they need to do to make it right. And that's true for lying, cheating, anything along those lines. And so you might start by saying, I'm guessing you lied because, or I'm guessing you were mean to that person, to your friend because, and it could be you wanted to save face. It could be you were mad at them about something. So you're giving them that excuse, that plausible excuse. I'm guessing you lied because you didn't want drama from me. I'm guessing you lied because you didn't want me to know, anyone to know that you didn't know what you were doing. Could be anything. And we always do want to be getting to the root of what's getting in their way, because if a kid is lying, unless they're really a young child and it's magical thinking, it really, there's a reason behind it, and it's in some way to protect themselves. And then the second thing you say is, that second step is, but it's not okay, and here's why. And we want to make sure that we're explaining why it's not okay. And then the third step is to help them figure out the path back, whether it's making amends, whether it's retaking a test, whatever it happens to be. But kids will get stuck in shame if you don't walk them through the entire 3-step process. Labeling why, giving them that excuse, that plausible excuse, which will help them get out of that fight, freeze, or flight part of their brain and reason with you. And then from there, helping them problem solve. We also want to make sure that we're monitoring what they're accessing and posting. And there's actually a lot of research saying the average age for kids seeing porn, whether they want to or not, is around 10 or 11. And I know from my own students that if they do see stuff that they don't understand, they're probably not going to ask a parent about it. They're probably going to ask like a fellow 8th grader, and they're going to get some wackadoodle information. So I would just make sure you're giving them access to accurate information, and whether they're comfortable talking to you or whether you have to get books and materials for them. But now more than ever, they're spending so much time online, and I'm hearing from my students that they're also seeing a lot of violence online, crazy things like beheadings and stuff. So have a sense of what they're seeing online and have those conversations with them. And I think we're good. You can go to the next one. So this third category is about emotional regulation. And I talked a little bit about nuts and why we want to teach them to be proactive and why we want them to have agency, so that instead of just feeling like, sitting around thinking, I have no friends, I'm a loser, no one invited me to the Netflix party, to say, okay, that hurts, that's real, but what can we do to help you feel better right now? Do you want to call a different friend? Do you want to watch a movie with me, whatever it happens to be? But we want to be really working with our kids to understand that they have some agency, that they don't have to, feelings are not something that just happens to you. I like using a feelings wheel because most kids have a very, very narrow feelings vocabulary. So when you have a narrow feelings vocabulary, you go straight to the extremes. You're joyful, or you're angry, or you're depressed. But if you have a much broader language, it's protective, because you can actually see those shades. You might realize you're bored, or that you're discouraged, or that you're frustrated, or that you're irritated. And it's not only good to have those shades of emotions because it helps you manage them better, it also helps you figure out what you need to do to fix the problem. So if you can identify that you are stressed, and that you're stressed because you're worried about coronavirus, and you're worried about coronavirus because you're worried that you don't know what your school is going to do to make sure everyone is safe, well, then a solution might be to call the school and find out what their plan is to have a safe reopening. So you can help a kid actually get the answers that they need and figure out if it's reassurance, figure out if it's information, whatever is on their mind. Helping them get to that problem-solving phase is key. And we want to make sure that we're exposing kids to whatever they're afraid of. And right now, I'm seeing a lot of regression. A lot of kids are having insomnia. A lot of really young kids who have been potty trained are no longer potty trained. I heard a funny quote the other day from a parent who said, if you think potty training is hard, try teaching a tween a sense of urgency. And I thought that was so great because I don't know any tweens who have a sense of urgency, but a lot of times they're avoidant. If they're anxious about something, they're going to be avoidant. And it could be that when they go back to school, they're feeling anxious about it. I have one of my kids who they're thinking about doing a hybrid program, and that child doesn't even want to go back. It's been too long, and there's just a lot of anxiety about going back. So you want to make sure that you're giving kids a little bit of exposure. And what I like to do is to have kids rate their fear on a scale of 1 to 10. So let's say it's public speaking. I'll say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how scary is it? And maybe they'll say it's a 9. And then I'll say, okay, so what would be a risk in the 4 to 7 range? And the reason you're shooting for that 4 to 7 range is because if you don't push them at all, then you're reinforcing this idea that they can't handle the stress. But if you push them too far and too fast and it doesn't go well, then what happens is that forevermore they avoid that activity. So it's getting that sweet spot, and that 4 to 7 range is perfect. So I've had kids, I'll use public speaking as an example. I'll have kids do things like hold their paper and read it while they're talking. Or I had one kid who gave the presentation with their back to the classroom. I had one kid who was willing to do it for the teacher and a couple of friends. And what I'm always looking to do is make sure that they don't opt out completely, that they try something, that they take a little bit of a risk and they're moving in the right direction. I'm seeing that with the video camera now on Zoom with classes, and that's been a major issue across the country. Most public school systems are not requiring the video camera because it is the camera is an equity issue. There's no way to know if the kid is in an unstable home environment and they don't want their classmates to see something going on. They have no way of knowing if the kid is in front of a Taco Bell so they can get Wi-Fi. They have no way of knowing if the kid is in the bathroom because it's the only room in the house where there's space. So I completely get it as an equity issue. But what I think we want to be doing, if there is nothing getting in the way and they're just anxious about being on, maybe because other kids are not on and they feel self-conscious, or they're just, because of their age, they don't like looking at themselves, to ask them what the problem is. And I found that a lot of my students will say, it's just, they're not worried about being judged by their classmates. It's anxiety producing and distracting to look at themselves. So some of my students have started covering the window with their own picture because it helps them concentrate. And I actually put it in the same category as public speaking. I think it's a useful skill to get comfortable seeing yourself on the camera. And so I've been working with my students in the same way. Are you willing to work toward getting back on camera? If you are, let's try to figure out what that 4 to 7 range is and get you moving in that direction, whether it's just their forehead that's online or whether they are willing to be visible for the first 5 minutes and the last 5 minutes. But I do think that we want to be asking the question and moving them in that direction, because not only will they be more engaged, but it's easier for the teacher to assess understanding. There's nothing worse for a teacher, by the way, than looking at a whole Zoom room of black boxes. So anyway, that was just another area where I was using the ranking system to help expose kids to their fears. The third one here is using a dartboard, and I have a magnetic dartboard. I use it with clients, I use it with students. And if you don't have a magnetic dartboard, it's okay. You can still do the same activity. What I do is I use it as a metaphor. When you have a thought, and I'll explain to kids that you think you wouldn't lie to yourself. And we lie to ourselves all of the time. We might catastrophize, we might overgeneralize, we might discount the positive. Think about a kid who 20 people say to them, oh, your haircut looks awesome, I love your haircut. And then one kid walks up and goes, you got a haircut. And then for the rest of the day, that kid is walking around like thinking something's really wrong with my head. That would be discounting the positive. So I'll explain to kids that your thoughts impact your feelings, which impacts your behavior, your physiology. You can end up with headaches or stomach aches if you're not feeling so good emotionally. So we want to be pulling our extreme thoughts back to the middle. So you don't have to be a bullseye using the metaphor of the dartboard. Many of our thoughts are not going to be bullseyes, and that's okay, but we don't want that dart on another wall altogether. We want it to be somewhat in the vicinity. And one way to help your kid do that is to, when you hear words like always or never, or they hate me, any extreme language whatsoever, to really pause and challenge, help them challenge that thought, help them get in the habit of challenging that thought. And you can actually, they're called cognitive errors, and if you Google it online, you can find a list of them and share it with your kid. White bears, this is an exercise I do for kids who say there is absolutely no way that they can get a terrible thought out of their head. Or you just know that they're unable to concentrate because all they can think about is this fight they had with a friend, or they failed a test and they're feeling bad about it. And so I will prove to kids by doing this exercise, first, that they can change the channel on their thoughts. And this is, again, about empowering them and giving them back that sense of control. So first I say to them, I want you to think about white bears for 60 seconds. And I will actually set a timer for 60 seconds. And they're looking at me like I'm crazy. And that's okay. People look at me like I'm crazy all the time. And then I ask them to think about anything but white bears for 60 seconds. And I set a timer again. And at the end of the 60 seconds, they look at me and they're like, all I thought about were white polar bears. All I thought about were white stuffed animals. And I know that. And that's when I give them a deck of cards. And I hand them the deck of cards and I say to them, I want you to pull out all of the twos. And so they take the cards out of the box, they spread them out, they pull out all of the twos, and then they hand them to me. And that's when I say, how often did you think about white bears? And they are amazed. And they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't think about white bears. And it's a way of proving to them that they have the power to distract themselves. They can listen to music, they can go for a run, they can call a friend. But if they think that they can't change the channel on their thoughts, that's actually not true. They really can. A lot of kids feel like they can't let go of a worry. And actually adults sometimes do this too. It's just, if there's something you haven't resolved, if there's something on your mind, you almost feel like you have to carry it with you nonstop, and it's exhausting. And I think everybody is running on fumes at this point, because a lot of the same anxieties that kids have, parents have as well. And I will literally have a child make a worry box. Even an 8th grader will make a worry box, like a shoe box with a slit in the top, and they can decorate it if they want, or they can do it, they can just keep it simple. And then I have them write down their worries on index cards or Post-it notes and put it in the worry box. And I explain that I'm not saying the worries don't exist, but you can set them aside. You can put them to bed for the night. And it's a way of giving them permission to let it go. Sometimes I'll even say to a kid, I'll carry it for you. Or as a parent, you can say, I've got it. I'll carry that worry for you. And it'll still be there tomorrow. We can go back and revisit it, but you want to make sure that they are, and with kids in the school setting, if it's getting in the way of their learning, I will schedule a worry time. Like, we're going to meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we're going to worry about this from 2:10 to 2:20. And it sounds so crazy and silly, but it really works, because kids do want to let go of the things that they're carrying around. There's good research. And the reason I included the journal about positive and negative emotions and this strategy of sending a positive note to someone else, or taking 2 minutes to send an email to someone that's kind and full of praise, is because those are ways that have been proven to buffer you, again, adults and kids, against secondhand stress. And as I mentioned earlier, there's so much emotion contagion right now that buffering them against secondhand stress is really huge. Sending a positive note to someone else, it could be a card to a relative, it could be a grandparent, it could be a kid in a hospital somewhere, it could be somebody who's in a nursing home who's a little bit isolated. It could be to one of their friends who they think is down. And it's win-win, because not only are you making yourself feel better, but you're also making someone else feel better. And that's also transcending yourself as a strategy in and of itself to manage stress. And then there's a whole bunch of mindfulness and relaxation strategies. But one of my favorites that I'll share today, just to give you one, I will take a ball. And this works particularly well with boys who like baseball or who like sports. And if they're losing it, if they're feeling out of control, if they are really angry, I will throw them a ball and they will instinctively catch it. I've yet to have a kid not instinctively catch a ball that I throw at them. And then I'll say to them, I want you to count as we throw it back and forth. And I want to see if we can get to 100. And I do this for a few reasons, but the main reason is that the fight, flight, or freeze part of your brain, the amygdala, is the part where you feel out of control. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain where you're doing problem solving and where you're thinking rationally and where you have empathy for others and self-compassion, that part is off when you're out of control. And what's really cool about the brain and what I explain to kids is that it's like a light switch. You can't have the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala firing at the same time. So if you can figure out a way to turn off the amygdala and turn on the prefrontal cortex, you're going to get into a zone where you can actually solve some of your problems and cool off a little bit. And one of the ways to do that is to retrieve language. And the counting, as you're throwing that ball back and forth, if they are counting, they have to retrieve language. So it works really well. If you're in a small space, you can do it with balloons and bat a balloon in the air. It's also a metaphor. I'll explain that you're batting away the stressful thought. It's going to come back, but you can bat it away again. Sometimes I have kids use Sharpie to put their emotion or the word that describes their feeling on the balloon, just to kind of bring it to life a little bit more. If your kid has test anxiety, by the way, have them take an object into the room with them. It can be a paper clip, it can be anything in their pocket. And right before they start taking that test, come up with 3 adjectives to describe it. If they don't have an object on them, they can look around the room and just choose an object. Again, it's just turning on the language center of their brain, getting them out of the panicking part of their brain so they can focus a little bit better. And there are lots of relaxation strategies too. Two of the ones, actually, you can go to the next slide because I think it's on the next one. So on this slide where it says be physically demonstrative, I think that's really important right now because kids are not getting that touch, that tactile interaction from other kids, and they're really missing it. If you ask a middle schooler in particular, if you could go back to last February and you knew what was coming, what would you do differently? I've asked that question and had about 6 or 7 different kids, boys and girls, tell me they would have run around hugging everybody. And that is what they're missing. They're just really missing the physical touching. And we think about young kids and wrestling and piling on top of each other like puppies, but even older kids and teens really need that too. And there was recent research showing that, and I've tried this with my 12-year-old who is a little bit skeptical, but I tell him it really is research. The magical amount of time that you should spend hugging is a minimum of 8 seconds to get the full benefit. And I will tell him he's doing it for me. And he is, because we all need it, but I'm hopeful that it's also useful for him to get that 8-second hug. 8 seconds is about as long as he can last anyway, so I'll take what I can get. But along the same lines, 2 ways to help your kids calm down. It's not a mindfulness strategy, but it's activating the parasympathetic nervous system, is to teach them to give themselves a hug. And I'm having kids do that if they wanted to hug each other, because they are in person now, to each do this. It feels like the other person is hugging you, and it mimics as closely as possible. Another way to do it is to take the thumb from one hand and just press on the palm of the other. And it can also activate that parasympathetic nervous system and help your body calm down. And we know the way you feel physically will impact how you are emotionally as well. So this is just a general slide, and then after this one, I'll turn it over to questions. But there's a quote from a developmental pediatrician at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. His name is Ken Ginsberg, and this quote has stuck with me for years. He said, "The wider the gap between who a child is and who they think you need them to be, the more they'll struggle." And I think that that's particularly true right now because there is so much that's topsy-turvy in their world, and they're having to learn how to do everything differently, from how they learn to how they socialize, to how they interact with us. And for the kids, for those of you who have kids in that tween age, it's a developmental imperative to separate from their parents and spend more time with their peers. And so this literally flies in the face of their developmental needs. And so this is a time when we really want to be honoring who they are, not trying to help them be something that they aren't, and using this time to get to know them. And I think that is maybe also another silver lining of all of this. Somebody told me the other day that I should stop saying silver lining and start saying shades of gray, because silver lining was too positive for them. So you can choose shades of gray if that feels more realistic. And then when you're talking to them, recognize that kids are so sensitive anyway. They're really bad at interpreting feedback. And so if there is any misalignment between the words you use, the tone you use, your body language, they're going to pick up on that inauthenticity. And the best example I can give is if you tell your child that you don't care if they get a C, and they come home with a C, and they tell you that, and you wait 30 seconds before you say, "That's no big deal," all they're going to remember is that 30-second pause. They're constantly studying us. to put those clues together. And if they're going to err on one side or the other, even if it's a positive or a neutral comment, they're going to err on the side of negative. So we have to make sure that, particularly now, that we're really careful about how we're talking about things. And one way to do that is to use words like phrases like "I wonder" or "I've noticed," instead of, "What were you thinking?" or "Why did you do that?" Those just happen to be really helpful phrases. If they make a mistake, I really like the phrase, "Were you your best self?" as opposed to "I'm judging you." Putting it back on them. Is this who you want to be? Were you your best self? And then share what's working for you, and make sure that when you're not feeling calm, that you process with a friend, with a rabbi, with a therapist, with somebody who is not your child, because they really right now need us to be that thermostat. They're going to be the thermometer going up and down. And I recognize that it's not easy to stay the thermostat right now, but the best predictor of a kid emerging from a trauma in good shape, there's actually the two best pieces of research that I found. One is that they have a caring, present, consistent, loving adult in their life, which I'm sure all of you are. And the second, and I think this is really interesting, is that their parents share their own oscillating narrative, the places where they hit bumps in the road, and the oscillating narratives of family members. So it could be the grandparent who is in the great-grandparent who is in the Holocaust, or the great aunt who is the first woman in the family to go to college, or the grandparent who started a business and then the factory burned down and they reinvented themselves. We want to make sure that we are helping kids understand that life is not linear, and helping them see themselves as the hero that can emerge from this journey, that they can learn from this and they can emerge with more skills. And I think that will, in the end, be the greatest gift, other than the family time that we've all had. I think the greatest gift will be that we don't normally teach our kids transition skills. I'm thinking of an author, Bruce Feiler, who wrote a book recently called Life is in the Transitions. And he talked about how all of us in our life have 3 to 5 life quakes, which are major disruptions or traumas that have aftershocks that can last for 5 years or more. And if you look at it that way, that means that all of us are spending 15 to 25 years of our life in a life quake. What's unusual right now is that all of us on the planet are having one at the exact same time. That makes it a little more challenging. But the flip side of that is that our kids are having to develop those calluses, having to learn those transition skills. I mean, it's hard to believe that just a few years ago, we were worrying about trophy culture and participation trophies, and were we making life too easy for our kids? And right now, we can't protect them from discomfort no matter how much we want to. And that's hard. I mean, as parents, we want to shield our kids from discomfort. We want to make their life perfect, but that's not actually our job. Our job is to help them recover when they experience the discomfort. And that if the only thing that you get right in all of this in your own head is that you are really loving and that you help your kid deal with the discomfort of being in a pandemic, then your kid's going to be totally fine. So with that, I will turn it over to questions.
Thank you, Phyllis. That was incredibly helpful. And I just want to turn it over to the group. You can take yourself off mute, or you can put yourselves in the chat. Just any reactions or questions or anything
Or
for this precious time.
observations. Yeah, I love to hear how other people are doing too.
I have a question. I think a lot of the strategies that deal with helping kids understand how their brains work is really, really powerful. And I wonder, are there any resources that you're aware of that help kids understand how their brains work, but sort of kid-friendly resources?
I'd have to think about I love the book The Whole Brain Child, which by Tina Bryson and Dan Siegel. I don't know that I would have a kid.
Can you hear?
Phyllis, we lost you.
Am I back?
You're back. Yes.
Okay, sorry. So a few years ago, even though that book is for adults, a few years ago, one of my fourth grade students whose mother is a therapist came to me and she said, I am on to my mother. When she gets down to my eye level and she looks me in the eye and talks to me, I know she's trying to turn on my upstairs brain. And I said, how do you know that? And she said, I read her book, The Whole Brain Child. And I shared that anecdote with Tina Bryson recently because I ended up meeting her. But so kids can read adult books, but that child is a little unusual. I like Conquer Negative Thinking for teens. That's Mary Alvord. If you have a teen, I like The Confidence Code for Girls by Claire Shipman and Katty Kay. If it's a younger tween, like 8, 9, 10 at the oldest, really. If you have a kid in that tween range, I would also recommend having a lot of books on puberty and sexuality around right now. That's really what their main interest is.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I'll let you read the question in the chat.
Yeah, so this is the video game question. Yeah, I mean, I get it. A class is not as exciting as a video game, and I think I would start with that empathy and validate that. Of course, you don't feel as excited to be on the class as you do on the video game, but that's your job. In the same way I go to work, you go to school, and that's your job, so you have to go to class, and there's no choice. With the video game, I mean, we're all going to fight that right now. And so we have to all decide what our limits are and what our rules are. And I do think it's helpful to generate those rules with kids to get their buy-in. And actually, if you generate the consequences with them as well, they'll come up with worse things than you would for them. I'm always amazed. Kids are much harsher than parents are when it comes to consequences.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
So one, I'm interested to know, do you have any advice for how to use siblings to sort of be a buffer to help out the tweens? I mean, they don't want to be around their parents, but they're around their parents all the time. Is it fair to ask the older kid to help out a bit and to engage them? Or is that too much on them?
Are they nice to the younger sibling?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And do they mind?
I mean, they're not jumping up and down to say yes.
You know, I would just ask them, what are you comfortable doing? Because it sounds like a really nice child who's willing to do it. And I would just be clear that you don't want to impose too much, and you're wondering what they're comfortable doing. But yet kids with siblings have really benefited in this time. It's been huge. I actually have a group for only children in right now that's going, because the only children are having a much harder time, and so I'm bringing them together. And that was a kid's idea, that they wanted that group. And so I do think that if your older child's willing to be a support, or if not, you can also rent a sibling. And I say that half jokingly, but I have rented my own oldest kid is now a freshman at college, and that was a real void for my youngest, who's a boy. He's not as thrilled about hanging out with his sister, who's in the middle. And one of my friend's sons is home doing a gap year because of everything going on with college. And I literally am paying him to come play baseball with my kid twice a week. And it's win-win, because the guy wants to make a little bit of money, and he someday wants to be a teacher. And my kid gets that big brother relationship and somebody to play with. So however you have to make it work, I do think this is a time to get a little bit creative. Was there a second one too?
No, I think that was good.
Okay. Who is the author of Conquer Negative Thinking? Oh, that is Dr. Mary Alvord, Alvord.
I had a question about, you mentioned the wider the gap, the more difficult it is for the kids, because my son, who's in 3rd grade, has so much time on his hands right now. So
Yeah.
I am trying to use this time to get him to be more responsible around the house.
Yeah.
Like asking him to take out the puppy, like you were saying. Like I had that fight, but I'm like, well, he does have time on his hands, or other things, but it's a constant battle with him to ask him to take more responsibility. Like, how much is too much? I mean, it's not asking too, I feel like I'm not asking too much. I'm just asking him to be part of the team in our family here. But I don't
I
know.
would-
Like, I feel like I'm constantly fighting him.
So I think it's really good to give him chores and responsibility. And I think that's something that's come out of this in a way that's different. Everybody has to pull their weight in a different way because you're together 24/7 and there's just so much to do, whether it's dishes or puppies. But I think what throws kids is unpredictability. They really like consistency and routine. And if they don't know when you're going to be asking or when they're suddenly going to be told that it's time to take out the puppy, you're going to have more conflict. If you have a chart and you come up with those rules together in advance, they're going to be far more agreeable. And I like to actually involve, is there a sibling too? Yeah, so I would,
two.
there's two siblings?
2 older ones, yeah.
Yeah, so I would have them rotate the jobs
They do.
and
yeah.
and have them and just have it be consistent and predictable so that when they're fighting with each other instead of with you. That's my strategy. I mean my kids will kill each other over whose turn it is to unload the dishwasher. But I'm like,
It's always someone else's turn. It's always someone else's.
yeah, but then it's not my problem. They can work it out, and those are conflict resolution skills, and those are good skills to develop. But do what you can to take yourself out of it.
Can I add? Does it ever work if a kid doesn't really? We're always trying to get kids to want to help.
Yeah.
And some of our kids, and I'm not going to name names, our oldest, for example, will always help. And, the youngest is always like, oh, God, am I right that you can't really get them to buy in? It's more about setting rules, setting blah, blah, blah.
I will. Yeah. I mean,
get them to really own it. And they just, one of them just is like,
well, I will explain to kids that you don't have to like math in order to do your homework. You don't have to like lifting weights in order to go to the gym, right? There's a lot of things that we can do even if we don't want to do them. And that's part of life. I wouldn't be that worried about whether or not the youngest doesn't like it or does like it, because a lot of that is temperament. And I have kids with different temperaments. I have one who I could ask him to do the most onerous task ever, and he'd be like, sure, no problem. And I have another one who it doesn't matter what I'm asking. It could be like, could you reach for the Kleenex that's 3 inches to your left? And you'd think I'm asking her to, like do something really horrible. So I think a lot of it is just temperament. And I would just focus on, these are the responsibilities and this is what we have to do. I don't care if you like it or not. Like that doesn't really matter. You're teaching them responsibility and follow through, and that they're part of a unit.
Right. So I'm probably right about these things. Never mind. I'm just kidding.
I have one more question.
That's a different counselor.
Do you have any suggestions, given that this is probably going to go on for quite a while, like sort of more long-term perspectives? I mean, this is not going to end soon.
No, I don't think it is either. And I think winter is going to be rough and holidays are going to be rough. And I think what we need to be thinking about is how do we help our kids connect, particularly as the weather gets colder. You're in North Carolina, so it won't be too bad. But whether somebody in the friend network has an outdoor heater so kids can continue to get together outside, or you put. I was taking a walk in my neighborhood and I saw somebody was projecting a movie onto the garage door. I think that we want to make sure what we want to be doing, and with traditions. And I'll use an example from the school setting that. Some kids were really upset they couldn't do the Halloween parade that they normally do. And this was in a school that was virtual. And the teacher decided to have all of the kids come to the Zoom in costume, but without their cameras on. And they did 20 questions to guess what costume the kids were wearing. And then they would show themselves. And I thought that was a great way to create a new tradition. It was still Halloween. It was still, they were getting in their costumes, but it was a new tradition. And I think as we're heading into winter, and holidays, to really just crowdsource and start thinking about what we can do to recreate some traditions. The other thing is that people are not seeing extended family in the same way that they normally do. And we're such an individualistic culture right now. We're not used to interacting like family with neighbors or with friends. And I think we might want to be revisiting that. I was talking to an elementary school in my neighborhood, and one of the parents said, "What should I do for my child who really doesn't have any friends and is really struggling?" And I said, that your question is actually backwards. What we should all be thinking is, if my kid is doing okay, what can we do for the kid who doesn't have any friends? Like, I think this is a time when we need to be really encouraging our kids to talk to us about who they think might not be doing okay. The suicide rate is going up. The rates of anxiety and depression are going up. They were already going up even among 10 to 14-year-olds before this. And so I'm really worried about kids' mental state and parents' mental state as well. So if you're doing, I kind of think the onus is actually on the people who are doing relatively okay to, at least right now, to reach out and look for the kids who are not doing okay, or for the members of the community who are not doing okay, because that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to use our own community in a way that I don't think we're necessarily primed to do, particularly people who are not part of a religious congregation.
And I'll just say, and maybe if there's one more question, we can take a bit up, or we can just wrap up here. But just a commercial notice is that, we're not going to be doing the beach Shabbaton for obvious reasons. The Saturday night of that weekend, we are going to be, we're as a staff starting to plan some outdoor Hanukkah candle lightings, like we did for shofar blowings, and just to what Phyllis just said, I welcome all of our participation in how Bethel can do that work, both for each other and potentially for the broader community as well.
I love the outdoor Hanukkah candle idea.
Perry Whithead is a blacksmith, and he's going to be making us some mama chama, some big, Chabad, 9 feet tall, 6 feet wide. We're going full bore right on our Hanukkah candle lighting. So
Are those going to be electric or oil?
No, oil. Yeah.
Oil
There's
is
gonna
going into.
Yeah, fire. That's the best, right? There's.
Right.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Alexandra, you can press the stop on the record button, and we will make this